just to tell you where I'm coming from, basically, I was born in an internment camp with Japanese Americans during World War II. In 1945, in April. And Franklin Delano Roosevelt likes to call the bombing of Pearl Harbor the day of infamy. I would submit to you there are two other days of infamy, August the 6th and August the 9th of 1945, where in Hiroshima, 140,000 civilians primarily were killed outright, women, children, elderly. And in Nagasaki, 3 days later, 80,000 succumbed. I went to medical school in the 1960s, basically, at University of California, San Francisco. And if you know the Bay Area, it's a very progressive area. And so I used to go across the Bay to protest the Vietnam War. And that was a time of flower children and where acid or LSD was popular. And if you notice the placard there says drop acid, not bombs. And that was the time of the Martin Luther King assassination, and I was very active with a group called the Medical Committee for Human Rights. We started out as Medical Committee for Civil Rights, and started by Jack Geiger. Dr. Geiger actually was one of the leaders starting Physicians for Social Responsibility, which I belonged to for, what, almost 3 or 4 decades now. And Jack also actually started the Physicians for Human Rights. So he's the only physician I'm aware of who's won 2 Nobel, who's actually helped start organizations that won Nobel Peace Prizes. Of course, Linus Pauling also won 2 Nobel Prizes, one for physics and one for peace. My career, basically, I had to serve in the military. I was a physician, serving as the medical officer for the Cruiser Destroyer Force, the 7th Fleet during the Vietnam War. In fact, I was on board the USS Turner Joy. And if you know anything about history, the Turner Joy and the Maddox started it all in the Gulf of Tonkin incident. And I was on board the Turner Joy, and at the ceasefire, she was allowed to fire the last 2 rounds of naval gunfire. And, you know, probably scared a couple dogs that were on the beach or whatever. But anyway, that was the end of the war at that point. I basically recently retired from the Permanente Medical Group, so I worked for Kaiser Permanente for 38 years, basically. And I was honored to have a number of hibakusha on my panel of patients, actually 12, and at this point I think 8 are still alive. My wife, who's back there, and my 2 sons, when they were aged 5 and 8, were participants in the Great Peace March for Global Nuclear Disarmament, which a peace march that marched from Los Angeles to Washington, D.C. over something like 8 months. Started in March and wound up in November of 1986. And that was the same year that the Chernobyl disaster occurred. As you see on the brochure, basically, I belong to both Physicians for Social Responsibility and IPPNW. The International Physicians for Prevention of Nuclear War basically is the global organization that Physicians for Social Responsibility is a U.S. affiliate for. I don't know how many of you know, but there was a nuclear accident at Santa Susana in the late 60s. Rocketdyne had a nuclear reactor, and they had a core meltdown. And so I've been serving on the public participation group for the state of California, basically examining the effects of that meltdown. Actually, so Rocketdyne was responsible, but Boeing ended up buying or taking over the area, and what we learned recently from the EPA basically is there's still cesium-137 in the groundwater in Santa Susana. Okay, and this is the late 60s that this disaster occurred. And I just want to mention Albert Schweitzer, because I started the Los Angeles Albert Schweitzer Fellowship. I also belong to the National Board of Directors of the Schweitzer Fellowship. And I don't know how many of you know anything about Albert Schweitzer. Albert Schweitzer basically was the world's expert on Johann Sebastian Bach. He performed it like no one else could. Not only did he perform it on the organ, he built organs. And to this day, there are about a half dozen cathedrals in Europe that have organs that Albert Schweitzer built. And he studied the physics of sound at that time, and so the sound that comes out of these organs is said to be second to none, much better than Wurlitzer and some of the other organs that are out there. He was also a theologian, okay? He basically was in charge of his church and what have you. He had a doctorate in theology, and in his early 30s, he gave up both, well, he didn't really give them up, but he left his theological practice and his musical career to become a physician, and he dedicated his life to community service from that point on in Africa, in what was then French Equatorial Africa, now Gabon. Started the Lambaréné Clinic in the early 1900s, and he had a philosophy called the reverence. He had reverence for life. And he also had a statement that you should make your life your argument. So if you can live your life as your argument, then you'll go to heaven, basically, in his mind. And the last 10 years of his career, he spent opposing nuclear war. He met with J. Robert Oppenheimer and his very good friend Albert Einstein, and they convinced him that nuclear war is not something we want to do. Unfortunately, he passed away in 1965, but in 1949, he had his one and only visit to the U.S. He went to Aspen, Boston, Chicago, New York, and he gave a concert, a Johann Sebastian Bach concert, and that started the Aspen Music Festival. He started the Aspen Music Festival. He also gave lectures in Boston, Chicago, and New York, and the people who heard him speak about reverence for life and how all life on earth is so precious, they started an organization called the Society for Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. That was his doing also. He won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1952. In 1957, he had a very famous paper called the Declaration of Conscience. And based upon that, Rachel Carson, the mother of ecology, in her book Silent Spring, dedicated the book to Albert Schweitzer. He actually gave counsel to many of the physicians who started Physicians for Social Responsibility in the early 60s. In 1963, when JFK signed the Limited Test Ban Treaty, JFK acknowledged Albert Schweitzer as a towering moral influence of our century. Okay, last year, March the 11th, 2011, as you all are aware, there was a 9.0 earthquake in Japan, in Fukushima, and a tsunami that followed. And as you're well aware, Fukushima Daiichi had 6 reactors, and interestingly, I had a communication from Health Minister Hosokawa's office asking if I might want to comment on what they already knew about reactors 1 and 6 at that point. But in very short order, I got another email from the office of Chief Cabinet Secretary Edano saying, "Thank you for your interest in this matter, but we certainly have no need for your services at this time," suggesting that they already knew they had issues. But following that, I've had innumerable invitations to speak to primarily Democratic clubs because everyone is very concerned that, given the fact that California has 2 nuclear reactors, both of which are on earthquake fault lines, San Onofre and Diablo Canyon. But when I remind people that it was not the earthquake that did in Fukushima Daiichi, it was the tsunami that followed. And think about it, of the 102 other nuclear reactors in this country, the vast majority are in the Midwest, in floodplains. Not only that, some of them are in Tornado Alley. So Tornado Alley and nuclear radiation and what have you, that's just like a nuclear bomb.